All right, so today we are going to discuss some events leading to the Civil War and also the beginning of the Civil War. So, the first about 14 slides that we're going to discuss briefly just what was going on between about 1820 to 1858. You don't have to take notes on this. These are just some major events that kind of led to the Civil War. And then I will let you know when you can start taking notes. So one of the first major things that we need to look at is the Declaration of Independence. We know that it was signed in 1776, and we basically established the United States with slaves. And so the question was always during this time, the Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal, but are they really equal? So no slaves would basically mean that we would not have our southern states. So they basically would not support the Declaration if we outlawed slavery. There was also the Three-Fifths Compromise, and to gain more representation in Congress, the southern states needed slaves to be counted as people, basically. So what the compromise was basically for every 5 slaves, they would count as 3 people, and we talked about this before. Now, before 1825 and the census, it really wasn't a major issue. We know the Southerners depended on slavery. The Northerners were busy develop industrially. But, as time goes on and the population's growing, we're starting to see that the Southern population in Congress is growing. So we started to question if we should still have it. We also have seen the growth and expansion of industry and of the cotton industry. So in 1793, we know that Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin, and it was supposed to make lives for the slaves better, maybe even outlaw slavery, but from what we know, it actually increased what the slaves were expected to do with cleaning the cotton and producing more. Now, prior to this, keep in mind, slaves could only clean and process about 1 pound of cotton a day. After the cotton gin and the machinery, the Industrial Revolution, we know that it's 50 pounds a day. Once we perfected the cotton gin and once we had more industrialization with the Industrial Revolution, we saw upwards of 1,000 pounds of cotton produced a day. So the Industrial Revolution in Britain is also creating a demand for cotton. This can now be met. And we know that cotton can be basically grown anywhere in the South, so we do have a need for more slaves. Now, the Missouri Compromise of 1820 we have talked about, and that's also the Missouri Compromise line, the 3630 line, and we did admit Missouri as a slave state, knowing that we were also going to admit Maine as a free state. So even though Missouri is above the 3630 line, we did admit them. Any other state that's going to be admitted to the United States, they would basically be free states. The 3630 line did also divide the rest of Louisiana into slave and free territories. With westward expansion, this is a political cartoon, basically Congress, the national government, and who is going to control which parts of the United States. Now, we have something known as a manifest destiny that basically states that it's our God-given right to expand our territory from coast to coast, but there is going to be a huge debate over slavery and territories. We gained a lot of territory due to the Mexican-American War, and a lot of people started to have this feeling of sectionalism. And basically what this meant is they were going to be loyal not just to the United States. They did have that loyalty, but there was more loyalty to their region that they lived in. And so this cartoon represents that sectionalism and that idea of staying loyal to our region. And so there's going to be a lot of controversy over should we allow slavery in territories or not. Now, there is going to be something called the Wilmot Proviso, and it's going to be presented in Congress from David Wilmot. And what he did in 1846 is he's going to suggest funding a bill. that's going to prohibit slavery in any territory that was acquired by Mexico. He did not like the idea of slavery in territories, and we were really trying to decide what to do with this Mexican territory that we had gotten from the Mexican American War. So, what ends up happening is the bill is passed in the House, but it actually is defeated in the Senate. And because of that, it did not pass. And so, still, it's going to be what are we going to do with the notion of slavery in some of these territories? Now, in 1848, we are going to see, and I'm sorry that's cut up at the top, the Free Soil Party is going to develop. They're going to form in 1848, like I said, and basically they had one platform. Their platform was they were an anti-slavery party. Now, they did not talk about anything else. All they were concerned about was this whole notion of abolishing slavery. So they nominated two candidates. The first one being Martin Van Buren. He's going to run for the presidency, and Charles Adams is going to run as the vice presidency candidate. So they did run in the 1848 election, and they did not carry a single state. So it wasn't very successful. They just needed more than just being an anti-slavery party. All right, so we're going to have the Compromise of 1850. We know that a lot of people are settling out west, and that we need to decide what we're going to do with some of this territory, specifically California. So the Compromise of 1850 did a couple things for the North, and it did a couple things for the South. For the North, we are going to see California admitted as a free state. We are also going to see the slave trade. It's going to be abolished in Washington, D.C. Up until this point, it still did exist in the D.C. area, and people didn't like it. It was too close to the Northern Territory. And the South also gets something. And like it states, this is a compromise. So the Northerners have to compromise with the Southerners and vice versa. So the territories of New Mexico and Utah are going to be organized under popular sovereignty. They are going to be able to choose for themselves if they would like slavery in these territories or not. Texas, we are going to assume Texas's debt, the federal government, and Texas has to give up some Western land claims. Also, we are going to see the fugitive slave law, and that is, we've talked about this. This is where if you knew of a runaway slave, or if you were a runaway slave and you were in Northern Territory, you were going to be returned to your rightful owner. Now we're going to see the abolitionist movement start to grow. And it's going to start growing more frequently. Many believe that slavery was going to die out because it wasn't economically efficient. The cotton gin, it helped increase the notion of slavery, but people started to view slavery as morally wrong. And it started in large numbers. And so a lot of people started to demand for its end or restrictions on it. Now, there's going to be a woman named Harriet Tubman who's going to start the Underground Railroad. It wasn't a railroad, it was not underground, but it was a network of escape routes. And you can see from the map some of the escape routes that slaves were able to take. Most slaves would travel at night, and they wouldn't travel on major streets or roads because they did not want to be seen. So you are going to have the tracks, which are the escape routes. You're going to have the stations, which basically were safe houses or barns that people had set up to keep the slaves safe during the day. And then the conductors, the landowners that allowed the slaves to pass through their property. And so we're going to see this start growing. This is going to upset the South because they feel that the Northerners are helping take property away from them. You're going to see slave codes develop in the South. And basically, we know that slaves had no right. They're going to be treated as possessions. Their daily life is extremely harsh. And the slave owners, to prevent any more escapees, they would not let them gather in groups. They would not let them assemble. And another big thing that was in the slave codes is they were forbidden to learn to read or write. They didn't want to educate the slaves because if they educated the slaves, they would be able to escape or move to the north. In 1836, we are going to have the Congressional Gag Order, and this was put in effect in an effort to prevent continual fighting in Congress over this whole notion of slavery. So what this gag rule did, was it forbid the introduction of laws that were going to limit slavery on the floor of the House. So any federal legislation that was trying to be introduced against slavery is going to be temporarily halted. So it really did halt the anti-slavery movement. Now, eventually it's going to be repealed in 1844 because it was limiting people's freedoms under the Bill of Rights. Okay, so we talked a little bit about this, some new slave laws that are going to develop. The Fugitive Slave Law is going to be part of the Compromise of 1850. Under the Fugitive Slave Law, there's a couple other things that are going to develop. You can be denied a trial by jury and some other rights. And like I said, Northerners are going to be forced to be part of slavery. Slaves under the slave codes are going to have stricter rules. And because of these things, we are going to see the anti-slavery movement growing in the North. Now, in 1848, a book's going to be published. Harriet Beecher Stowe is going to write a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. And it's a novel that really talks about life of slaves in the South. This is going to outrage Northerners, and more people are going to join in the abolitionist movement. Now, the Southerners feel assaulted, and they're enraged by this because they feel that they're being picked on, that having a slave and owning a slave is their right, and people just don't understand this at this time. Oops, sorry about that. Okay, so we're going to have the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Okay, and we talked about this a little bit. This is going to be introduced by Stephen Douglas, and it basically proposes Nebraska Territory to provide a northern route for the Transcontinental Railroad. The territory lays north of the Compromise line, and we know that anything north of the Missouri Compromise line prohibits slavery. And so there's a lot of people that are against this. And so what ends up happening was Douglas, he does need Southern support in order to have this Transcontinental Railroad pass through the Northern Territory. So what he proposes is a bill to allow popular sovereignty in territories to decide if they want slavery or not. Nebraska does want slavery in their territory, but he can't garner the support because we know that anything north cannot have slavery. So obviously there's going to be a firestorm of controversy. A lot of free soilers, people that do not want slavery in Northern Territory, are going to be upset by this. Douglas is able to get the bill passed through Congress. 90% of Southern Congress members and half of the Northern Democrats end up voting for the bill. So what ends up happening is this territory is going to be divided into Kansas and Nebraska. And it's going to lead to a lot of violence in the area because you have people, abolitionists that are here, and you have people that are pro-slavery. And so there is going to be a lot of controversy on what is going to happen in these two states. The last thing I want to talk about is the Dred Scott case. Now, the Dred Scott case involved this slave, his name is Dred Scott, and he was moved to free territory, and he lived there under his master for several years. Now, under the Northwest Ordinance and the Missouri Compromise, he should have been a free slave. And so he sued for his freedom under the Northwest Ordinance. The case went through the court system, and it actually made its way up until the Supreme Court in 1857. So the decision is going to be made, and the Chief Justice, Roger Taney, is actually going to write the decision. And basically what happens here is Taney ruled against Scott. The Supreme Court ruled that Congress could make no laws regarding slavery in the territories. And although they ruled that slavery was legal in territories, it had also stated that it could not exist unless that there was a local police force there to regulate it. So slaves as non-citizens, also the case shouldn't be tried because they had no constitutional rights. They were not citizens of the United States. State laws under the 10th Amendment is going to determine a slave's freedom, and it's not a federal government right. So Congress's power to create territorial rules to say that there could be slavery or not did not include this. And so it actually was ruled that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. So what that basically meant now is slaves could choose for themselves if they were going to have slaves, if they were going to be a slave state, a slave territory, or not. All right, so these are some events that led up to the not to the American Revolution, to the Civil War. And the Civil War is going to begin in 1861. There's a few things that we do need to talk about before, and this is where you're going to start filling in your notes. So the first thing to talk about, in 1858, you're going to have the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And so you have Abraham Lincoln and you have Stephen Douglas. And they are running for a seat in the Senate, Illinois Senate. Abraham Lincoln is going to run as a Republican and Stephen Douglas is going to run as a Democrat. Now, Lincoln and the whole notion of slavery is going to come up, and Lincoln, we know, opposes slavery. And he doesn't like it. He doesn't agree with it in U.S. territories. Douglas believes in the idea of popular sovereignty. So he feels that it should be left up to the states, excuse me, to decide if they want slavery in their territories. Now, Douglas ends up winning the re-election because he is the incumbent, but Lincoln, a lot of people start looking at Lincoln as a contender for the presidential nominee for the Republicans. And that is going to come up in about 1860 for the presidential election in 1860. Now, in 1859, we are going to have something called John Brown's Raid. And John Brown's Raid is going to take place in Harper's Ferry. He's a very radical abolitionist. And basically, what he's trying to do is lead a group of abolitionists to overthrow the National Armory in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He is going to capture the arsenal, and he actually takes several hostages. His thought was that his plan was to arm freed slaves, and they would be able to fight against the Southerners, and it would bring the end to slavery. What he didn't take an account for is there were a lot of Southerners that were good generals and they were good military leaders. And Robert E. Lee he's a colonel at this time, he's going to lead troops into Harper's Ferry, and he's going to end up putting an end to the raid rather quickly. So Brown is going to be seen as Southerners' worst nightmare, but he is going to be captured. He is going to be hung. And this really is going to, he's tried for treason, but it really is going to increase the tension between the North and the South. This is going to alarm the Southerners, this whole John Brown's raid. They see it as abolitionists and the Republican Party, their plot to incite rebellion throughout the South. So these are just a couple pictures of John Brown and him being taken out of, the picture on the right, he is on his way to his execution. Now in 1860, we are going to have a presidential election, and we are actually going to see 4 candidates. It's very unusual, but we have people that have different beliefs at this time. So you're going to have 4 candidates who are going to split the vote. You're going to have Abraham Lincoln. He is going to run as a Republican. You are going to have Stephen Douglas, who's going to have the Democratic nomination, believes in popular sovereignty. You're going to have John Bell, who is going to be running under the Constitutional Union Party. And he actually wants to preserve the Union. He wants to avoid the whole slavery issue. And then you're going to have John Breckinridge, who's going to be a Southern Democrat. Now, Lincoln basically is going to win due to the split in the Democratic Party, because you do have Northern Democrats with Stephen Douglas and John Breckinridge with the Southern Democrats. And so when you have a split in a political party, it's going to split the votes, which gives Lincoln all the Republican votes. So Lincoln actually still does oppose slavery, but he is not willing to outlaw it at this time. He doesn't think it's time. He wants to preserve the Union, but most Southerners are still going to perceive him as a threat to the institution of slavery. Now, that word down there is going to be cut off. It is going to be slavery, that they view him as a threat to the institution of slavery. So, just to show you the election vote and how it came about, you can see down here Lincoln basically takes all the northern votes. He also gets Oregon and California. You have the Southern Democrats, which is Breckinridge. He garners a lot of votes because he's going to carry basically the Southern votes. Constitutional Union. This is going to be carried by Bell, and these are going to be your border states. So we can see the split now in the United States. And then Stephen Douglas is only going to carry one state. He's only going to carry Missouri. So the popular vote, Lincoln gets about 40%, but he does garner 59% of the Electoral College vote. And then the brown is represented by the different territories we have. So we know that people are going to be upset with this, that Lincoln now wins and that he's going to be a threat to the institution of slavery. So, in response to Lincoln's victory, South Carolina becomes the first state to secede from the Union. And they are going to secede from the Union in December of 1861. And I'm sorry, 1860, about a month after the election. Soon after, other states are going to follow. But there are going to be some slave states, and they're going to be represented by these blue right here, that are going to remain in the Union. And these are going to be our border states. Now, West Virginia is actually going to secede from Virginia, and they're going to form their new state and stay with the Union. But you can kind of see the progression of the secession. And it was kind of this domino theory. It only really took one state before other southern states were going to follow. So the states that secede from the Union, they are going to make a separate nation, the Confederate States of America. Now, in 1861, this is going to be pretty much the first battle of the Civil War. And it's going to be the Battle of Fort Sumter. It's going to take place on April 12th in 1861. And Fort Sumter was guarding Charleston Harbor in South Carolina. South Carolina, because they seceded and they were now part of the Confederacy, wants the fort. But Lincoln was not going to allow the Confederates to take over this because it was government property. Now, the Confederates attack, and because there is not a lot of presence of Union military, they are able to win Fort Sumter. And so now we need to figure out Okay, I apologize for that. I had a phone call. So, continuing on, Lincoln had a dilemma that he was really concerned about and why he should fight this war. We know we were going to go to war. We had Fort Sumter attacked, we lost there, and so we know that this is going to happen. So, the question is, do we have states' rights versus preserving the Union? He doesn't want to fight the war to end slavery. He wants to fight this war to preserve the Union. The moral issue at hand is slavery, but the legal issue is who has the right to make decisions regarding issues like slavery. So we know that it's going to be in the whole idea of making decisions. Should it be left up to the states or should it be left up to the federal government? Southerners claim it is a state's right, which is why they left the Union. So at the very beginning of this war, he is not fighting the war to end slavery, but he's fighting this war to preserve the Union. Okay, so if we look at some North versus South as far as this war goes and what some of their differences are. Now, population in the North is going to be significantly larger. We are going to have over 20 million people living in the North, and the Southerners are going to have about little less than 10 million. So, what that means for the North is there's going to be more people available to serve in the Army to produce supplies and weapons. The North is also going to be more industrialized, and that's going to help us because we have that industrialization to um, make the supplies, make the weapons. Abraham Lincoln is going to be the commander in chief for the Union, and people feel that he is a great representative and he's the great person to be president of our country at this time. Now, for the Southerners, they have great military minds and they have great military leaders. Robert E. Lee is very strong. He has a great military mind, and they are going to be led by some great leaders. The South knows its territory. The Northerners have to go to the South. And so the South is going to be able to fight on their own soil. They know the territory, and it is strong motivation for them because they do not want to lose their territory. All right, so last thing to talk about is how are we going to defeat the South? How are we going to get them back into our Union? And so there is a plan that is going to develop. It's going to be known as the Anaconda Plan. You can see from the visual, an anaconda is a huge snake. And from what we know about it, it wraps itself around people and really just takes their lives. And so that's kind of what we wanted to do as far as having this plan. So it's going to be introduced by Winfield Scott, and the plan is going to be threefold. So the first thing that the plan proposes is to have a blockade of the southern ports. And what we're going to try to do is cut off the exporting of cotton because that's their major source of income at this time, and any military supplies that may come in. The second thing we want to do is divide the Confederate into two. So we want to advance down the Mississippi River, and the blockade would basically divide that Mississippi Valley into two. And they would have hopefully a hard time communicating with each other, and now they would have to fight a two-front war. And the third aspect of this was to the Union armies, once we cut off the ports, we seize the land in the Mississippi Valley, is to capture the Confederacy and capture its capital, which is going to be Richmond, Virginia, attack them at their heart. And so what we were going to try to do really is surround them and suffocate them, is really what an anaconda does. So we were going to try to suffocate them out. The snake image kind of caught on to a lot of people with this Winfield Scott's plan. And so this gave, because of this proposal, giving the proposal its popular name. All right, so we are going to stop there. We will discuss this in more detail in class on Monday and Tuesday. If you do have any questions, feel free to email me. I'll check my email over the weekend. Hope you guys all have a great weekend too.